All right, everybody, good afternoon. Thank you for joining us once again on day 3 of our DSH Diversion Academy. Today we are focusing on identifying and coordinating treatment and support for diversion participants. I just have a couple quick reminders for you all before we get into the meat of today's program. Please, if you can, keep yourselves on mute while others are presenting so we can limit background noise. We are recording today's session, and that recording will be made available to you all as soon as it is fully processed. If you have any questions for us, you can use the chat function to send questions in, or you can raise your hand. We will have different points throughout today where we will open things up for questions. And I think also just a technical issue that a lot of folks have been having. If you do have to join today's session using your phone, if it is a smartphone and you are able to log in through the internet versus just calling in, that is advisable. When you just call in, we're finding the system doesn't put you into the right county breakout room. So that can sometimes be problematic. So if you are going to be calling in using your phone, if it's a smartphone and you can log in through the web browser on your smartphone, that would be preferable. So for today's agenda, we're going to go through just some welcome and some quick intros, and then move into some presentations by 2 of our national experts who are helping us out with these trainings, Dr. Deb Peinels and Dr. Sarah Demaray. We're going to have a short break and go into our first set of breakouts, followed by a discussion and overview from one of our existing diversion counties. The team from Kern County has agreed to join us today to talk to you all about, give you a little bit of an overview about their program and answer any questions you may have for them. We will have another quick break, then we will talk a bit about cultural considerations for treatment planning with this population. And then we will have our final set of breakout groups and report-ins, and then we will do wrap up answer any additional questions and go to next steps. And so I think with that, I will hand it over to Dr. Peinels.
Great. And can you hear me again? Just want to make sure.
Yes, I can hear you.
All right. So, my piece of today is to really talk a little bit about what services and treatment does a successful diversion program need. And that's really a very broad area of conversation, and something I'm sure you're all thinking about as you're going to build in your own programs. You can go to the next slide. So first, it's really something that communities need to consider is really thinking about standing up a diversion program as its own kind of activity and done with some intention and planning. Next slide. One of the first things that's really important is to really make sure that everybody is level set, all the stakeholders are level set around the same shared goals. So for example, of course, we want to improve clinical outcomes and functioning of the people that we're serving, but we also want to enhance public safety. And so we have to do a lot of things in between that to make sure that we're addressing multiple needs of individuals that become part of the goals. So one of the goals that I always like to set is thinking about this idea of community tenure. So it's not enough to just measure recidivism and rearrest or contact with police. And it's not enough to measure whether people go to the ED or go to the hospital, because sometimes both of those things, either of those things might happen. But what we really want to do as we help people with serious mental illness in their recovery is maximize their ability to stay in the community without disruptions. And if we look at it in a broad landscape like that, if we look at it broadly like that, then sometimes we can achieve success because we're really looking at our measure of success being that individual's functional capacities being as positive as possible. And that would involve them not getting into trouble, not hurting anyone, not being victimized, not being off their medicine and relapsing on with illness symptoms, and so managing their illness. So there's a lot of things that go into maximizing community tenure. That also requires the identification and linkage of individuals to comprehensive and effective community-based behavioral health care at whatever level of need that there is, as well as preventing homelessness to the extent possible. And then, of course, that ultimately gets to the enhancement of public safety. And so I really feel that this idea of recovery and public safety are mutually achievable goals as long as the system that's supporting the individuals is looking at both goals together. Next slide. So what are some common elements in diversion programs? First, you're going to have a planning period, and that is, I think, what you're doing right here with this Diversion Academy, is really thinking about your planning stages. Next is really thinking about your partnerships and your project team. Who needs to be at the table in the planning period, and who's on the project team? Both the local drivers as well as the sort of the concentric circles of people involved. So, for example, in some diversion programs that I've helped stand up, some of the members of the project team have been local acute hospitals or a local emergency department, who you wouldn't necessarily think is a natural partner, but if that's where people are going to end up when things are going awry, or when things are not, when they're having a relapse in symptoms, you might want to think about what are the services and how do we make sure that whatever we're doing wraps around where the partners are going to be. Again, clarifying your purpose and your mission. Some good diversion programs really start with really hammering out a mission statement. I used to be somebody that was like, oh my God, the leaders are pulling me into a meeting. We got to do a mission statement. There's no point to these mission statements. But actually, I really have come to be, and maybe it's because I've been working in government for a long time, but also running a lot of programs. I really feel like those mission statements really get everybody on the same page, and you get that buy-in for what you're trying to achieve. Then identifying your target population. Now, some of the funding that you're receiving sets out what your target population is already in terms of diagnoses that are encompassed in the diversion program. But how are you going to identify those? Some programs I've built up say that somebody has to have a previously established record showing that they have the diagnosis of schizophrenia, which means that the people looking at the record don't have to have that clinical degree. They just have to be able to read what's in the record. Others say, no, I want a clinician who's qualified to make a diagnosis to make sure that that's a correct diagnosis. So how do we identify the target population? And then what is the service delivery model going to look like? And we're going to talk a little bit more about service delivery models that can be brought to bear that have evidence surrounding them that talk about how to work with people with serious mental illness, and even those that are both seriously mentally ill and then also have justice involvement. What are the problem-solving strategies? So it's really good to set up a program that's got a lot of lofty goals and a lot of great goals and achievable goals, but you also have to bake in what is going to happen when things don't go as planned, because there's definitely going to be situations where things don't go as planned. In fact, if we're talking about people with co-occurring conditions, I think you really have to plan for relapses and not assume that those are going to be not happening, because we know with chronic illness, like substance use disorder, like serious mental illness, relapse and recovery are part of illness management. And so we have to identify those problem-solving strategies. Also, identifying data collection methods. Now, some of that will be driven by DSH and their needs, but really looking at data collection for your own benefits and also reviewing your own data to understand how do we make continuous quality improvement and what's the feedback loop of improving services. And I'll give some examples of that. Also, looking at how do we educate key stakeholders and how do we provide education in a way that cross-fertilizes so that we're not just educating one group, but we're educating through cross-trainings people together who are working on this model, this diversion model. We can go to the next slide. So in terms of getting started, you have your planning teams. Your planning teams are probably part of this Leadership Academy, this Diversion Academy. And then you set your frame for what is the leadership of the planning team going to look like, what is the administrative structure going to look like, who's setting the agenda, who's taking the notes, who's writing the protocols, who's helping to roll this out. That all needs to be set up as a start to the work that you're doing. Next slide. So over time, it's become more and more clear as you start diversion programs and other types of community-based or even hospital-based, but community-based programs, you have different roles, and we give each other titles. We all have titles in our jobs, but in reality, to run a project, you have people who can serve different, push different levers and have different strengths, regardless of their title, really. Just today, we were having this big meeting, and somebody needed to write a policy draft so that others could kind of review it and think about it and edit it. And you know, there's some people that will jump to fingers to the keyboard and want to draft things, and there's others that are going to want to take that second step of reviewing what gets drafted and commenting on it. And both are equally important jobs to get a project off the ground. So I like to think about these jobs, you know, you have your doers, you have your thinkers, you have your reviewers, you have people who know the money side of things, and then you also have to have champions who are really going to be able to take what is done, what is thought about, what is drafted, and basically sell it, not just sell it to the external stakeholders, but continue to sell it to the internal stakeholders who may be struggling as there are refinements that need to be made. And so really thinking about, and this is sort of project management 101, group management 101, you know, really thinking about what are the roles that your team can play and recognizing and honoring each of these roles so that you get the work done that you're trying to accomplish. Next slide. So what are some service examples that are out there in the literature that are worth considering as you build in your program and services? Next slide. Well, one of the ones I want to talk about is the Forensic Assertive Community Treatment Model. That's sometimes known as FACT. I don't know how many of you are familiar with the FACT model, but it's really a model that was designed to support individuals with serious mental illness who are criminal legal involved. And it takes off from the assertive community treatment model, which is an evidence-based practice that was designed many years ago as a hospital without walls. There was an early recognition that people with serious mental illness were revolving in and out of hospitals quite frequently, and that if we could build the multidisciplinary team around them, then we could perhaps reduce the number of hospitalizations that they would have in a year and the number of days within the hospital that they would use. And there became a whole evidence base around ACT services with fidelity, monitoring how big were the teams, what was the multidisciplinary team, what did it look like, what were their roles and responsibilities. And then one of the things that became recognized was that we had some people with serious mental illness who were not just revolving in and out of hospitals, but they were revolving, and they are revolving in and out of the criminal system as well. And so the FACT model was born out of that, where individuals with serious mental illness who were involved with the criminal justice system became actively involved in this cycling. And so the FACT teams were basically multidisciplinary ACT teams with an added component to pay attention to that criminal justice involvement. Next slide. Now, SAMHSA, the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, has come up with key components to FACT teams. And so if you are thinking that you want to build in FACT services to your diversion program, you want to think about some of the model development that's already been done. And what SAMHSA would say our key components are forensic services that address criminogenic risks and needs, and you're going to be hearing later more about that. Client eligibility based on a set of well-defined criteria, including not just the criteria of multiple hospitalizations, but multiple incarcerations. You want to have client access to round-the-clock, 24/7, 365, individualized treatment and social services that address their immediate needs and improve stabilization, which means you might need an on-call system to make sure that you have that round-the-clock need. Service delivery by an integrated multidisciplinary team that includes a criminal justice specialist or more than one, as well as cross-system mental health and criminal justice training of team members so that everybody understands how the mental health system is going to work and how the criminal legal system is going to work. Implementation fidelity to the ACT team as well as quality control, so to the ACT model, as well as flexible funding and implementation support. And these are kind of the model component parts that SAMHSA has laid out for any successful FACT team. So you might want to think about what it would take for you in your diversion program to potentially bake that into your model. Next slide. There's also a model of services called intensive case management. People working in the community would probably be familiar with this model. This is more than just case management or rehab options, which is often what case management bills under. This really provides for the management of mental health challenges along with rehabilitation and social support needs. And it is the idea behind it is that it's provided by a small team with smaller caseloads that offers 24/7, 365 support and community-based outreach. And so these teams are really there to provide multiple levels of case management support that focus on the individual's rehabilitation and social support needs, as well as focuses on ensuring that they're in treatment for their mental health symptoms. Next slide. The ICM model was reviewed from a research perspective in a Cochrane review in 2017, where they looked at multiple trials from around the world and saw that the trials that are in the literature don't really show great data quality because it's really hard when you're doing program development to have a very rigorous double-blind, they look for double-blind placebo-controlled type studies. But nonetheless, they came up with the conclusion that compared to standard care, intensive case management for recipients is more likely to help them remain in services, have improved overall functioning, get a job, not remain homeless, and have fewer hospital days. And so from that Cochrane review in 2017, we saw a lot of expansion of ICM services for individuals with serious mental illness. Next slide. SAMHSA has also put a lot out there regarding housing supports. One study that was published in the academic peer review literature actually comes out of Europe, which really showed that if you provide housing and support for mental health combined, you will have a decrease in the number of inpatient days with higher housing stability and cost savings in homeless persons with schizophrenia or bipolar disorders. And numerous studies point to supported housing as a means to help maximize community tenure for individuals with mental illness. And here again, SAMHSA has some really great toolkits that you can look at that help look at permanent supported housing as an evidence-based practice. Next slide. The tenets of supported housing involve this idea of permanence and affordability. So not sending people to a short-term placement, but really looking at how do we build in a housing support model that can lead to permanence and affordability, and how do we build our services where housing is really primary for the work that we're doing. Housing-oriented services with multidisciplinary team involvement, with the idea that individuals would engage in this housing on a voluntary basis, but that there would be assertive outreach to help people stay housed and to help ensure that their problems around being housed are met. Because oftentimes we're talking about individuals who have lived a long life of homelessness and may not be as adept at living in a housed way, in a domiciled way, as they were. The strategies, the survival strategies for homelessness don't translate necessarily to living in a domiciled way. Also, the supportive housing tenet includes that these individuals would be integrated into their communities and not isolated in many institutions, where there's emphasis on choice, which requires a lot of work around motivational interviewing strategies and the like, especially where there's substance use involved or co-occurring disorders, and low barriers to entry into these supported housing, meaning you want to have people that you don't want to make it so that people have to achieve maximum stability before they have access to housing. In other words, you want to have low entry barriers so people who are still struggling still may be available for these housing supports and be able to get this permanent and affordable housing even while they're still struggling with their condition, and that you focus on housing first as a priority while you support their behavioral health needs. Next slide. Co-occurring treatments is another major area that we really have to think about for the diversion work that we're doing. We certainly know that people in the competence to stand trial system and in the revolving door system between criminal justice, mental health, and substance use have co-occurring conditions, and that means mental illnesses, substance use disorders, and physical illnesses that really have to be looked at all together to ensure the maximum stability. Next slide. All too often we see that these services, however, are singled out and siloed. So one model that's been developed, and full disclaimer, I was part of the development team on this, is the MISSION model, which actually is an acronym that stands for Maintenance of Independence and Sobriety Through Systems Integration and Outreach Networking. And what we did was we looked at building in a model that incorporates services for individuals with co-occurring mental health and substance use conditions. And then in the criminal justice version of this, we built out a framework that takes into account the risk need responsivity model. So in other words, what we have is a case management and peer wraparound service model that delivers programming specifically around dual diagnosis, mental health and substance use disorders, and then incorporates that risk need responsivity paradigm to help build out a treatment plan. It's an evidence-based practice. It's got a resource with a participant notebook and a provider notebook. Next slide. So once you've identified what models you might try and implement in your diversion program, you're also going to want to build consensus around those models. And one of the things, lessons I've learned, and sometimes learn them in a tough way, is rolling out a program, but not necessarily bringing in all the stakeholders to understand the program and then to understand the program's possibilities, as well as some of the program's limits. So when I built programs, I can speak to a couple times where we built programs in counties where everybody thought that this program was going to be the be-all, end-all, and that there was going to be no relapses and no challenges. Well, obviously, that's not a realistic belief. And so that when there were challenges and relapses, people sometimes were caught off guard and thought, well, I thought that the behavioral health system was going to totally manage this problem. And yet we needed to come together around managing some of the challenges that came up. And so one of the ways that I've learned to help move diversion programs forward is thinking about whether a memorandum of understanding or a memorandum of agreement needs to be baked into the model so that everybody understands and everybody has a role to play in furthering the work of the model that's being developed for that community. And so really building in that consensus, even if it's not done through an MOU, even if it's done through meetings, building stakeholder buy-in, those are all going to be important elements that are going to be important as we think about rolling out diversionary services. Next slide. Then comes protocol development, which can be a step-by-step guide for screening, assessment, treatment. What does it mean to terminate somebody from the program? What does success mean? What does failure mean? Oftentimes when we're talking about people with chronic mental illness and substance use, we try not to talk about it in the terms of failure. We really talk about success and relapse, understanding that relapse is part of recovery. But if you have people that are criminal legal involved, there may be only certain tolerance for certain types of relapses or for certain types of behaviors, which might mean people are moved out of the diversion program and into a different kind of setting. Obviously, you want to try and minimize that, but you really have to anticipate what is going to be baked into the diversion program in terms of being able to count people as in the program versus not in the program. And then you want to consider any needed reporting forms or processes. So for example, is this going to be a program where probation needs a monthly report that the person is still engaged in treatment? And how detailed does that report need to look like? Next slide. Another thing that's been really helpful, and this is just a model that we used in one of our mission programs, is program flow charts. Really understanding, for example, really kind of detailing out how are we going to identify eligible participants. This was a reentry program that we were building. How do you identify participants? At what time point do you start to identify potential participants? Who's going to approach the participants regarding their interest in the program? Who's going to look at whether they're eligible for the program? Then the program and services start. What happens as they get into the program? Who are the contacts? Who's assessing their needs? What are the services that they're receiving? And then what do those assessments look like at various points in time so that data can be reported to the funder? So again, this isn't necessarily the one that you're going to build, but you might want to think about building in a flow chart so that you really understand roles and responsibilities and the pathway from the perspective of the providers as well as the perspective of the service recipient. Next slide. And then you're going to want to build in what are your program reviews going to look like as you're rolling out these services. So for example, are you going to bake in case conferences? I find it very helpful to have a mechanism for routine case conferences to try and understand where there might be ways that we can improve the service that we're providing. What about consultation? Who would be your consultant? How does that work? Whose roles, how do you clarify roles and responsibilities? Who's monitoring the documentation and the data reporting? And then who's supervising the line staff to give them the support they need to help the clients that you're engaging succeed and help your staff feel like they know what success looks like. Next slide. So that goes back to those common elements that I mentioned before. You've got your planning, you've got building partnerships and your project team, you've got to identify your mission, your target population, what service delivery model you're going to use, whether it's FACT, whether it's intensive case management, or other models that really focus on co-occurring disorders, how you're going to problem solve when problems come up, data collection and review, and then how do you improve your program and continually educate your key stakeholders. Next slide. This is an example that I just wanted to share with you around a data review that we did in one of our programs where we were doing an alternative to incarceration model where we had individuals with co-occurring mental health and substance use disorders. And what we wanted to know is, for example, we had a case manager and peer that were supposed to be meeting with clients. This is before COVID. And what we did was we set out expectations. We wanted people to meet a certain number of times per month in the beginning, for example, because we were using something called critical time intervention, which is more intensive supports up front. We wanted people to meet 16 times a month, which means 4 times a week, for the first few months, and then have that taper off. And that's the orange line that you can see, the expected line. And then what we did was we asked for tracking of what was actually happening with our case management and peers to see how often were they actually meeting with clients. And what we were finding was that they were actually ramping up more contacts as services were unfolding and only exceeding expectations in the midpoint of a 1-year program, maybe a little bit more towards the end. And then we talked to our case managers and peers to try and understand why this was happening. Well, when we talked to them, we learned a lot. Engagement was hard. People didn't want to meet. It was only after those relationships were building that they were able to have more contacts. And what we also found out was as programs were supposed to be winding down because it was a 1-year service model, people really were engaged and they didn't want to cut back the amount of times, and the clients were becoming more reliant upon people, and so they also wanted more outreach. And so it caused us to really look at our program model in a way that the data really told a story. Next slide. This was another example of looking at our at our program model in terms of what we expected for structured appointments of the peer support versus unstructured activities. And even though we expected more 21% of our peer supports to be structured because we had a group model that they were following, and then the orange dual recovery therapy was a structured model for the case managers, what we were seeing was a lot more unstructured visits that were actually happening. That the actual work of doing our cognitive behavioral intervention of dual recovery therapy, as well as setting up structured peer support sessions where we had really a manualized approach, was much harder to achieve than we had expected, and that the actual work of unstructured activities was becoming broader than the structured work. And so we had to do a lot of work around coaching with our staff to help understand what was happening, because it helped explain when the people we were providing services for weren't necessarily following the services. Well, if we weren't delivering the services that we thought we were supposed to be delivering, then we couldn't really sort of blame the client, or, we really had to look at ourselves. Not that you would ever blame a client, but you really want to look at your own delivery of services to ensure that you're getting maximum success because you're delivering what you're expecting your staff to deliver. And you never want to say, you never want to blame the client. And one of the things we're learning more and more about is it's not treatment-resistant clients, it's oftentimes client-resistant services. Like really pushing our service providers to provide the services that we wanted them to provide is sometimes really an uphill challenge. And there may be very realistic reasons. COVID is a current reason why it's really hard to do all this work. But it's really important to drill down on your data for quality improvement. And so that's another piece of any diversion program that I think is going to be relevant. Next slide. After we looked at all this data, this is a different example of a program that we built out in juvenile justice, is we really needed to build out knowledge, making sure that families, that community providers, that everybody was on the same page with what the resources were that we were offering and other resources that might be available to help support people. And so really figuring out how do we build out that education and awareness. I can't think of a program that I've rolled out where we didn't come up with a brochure to help everybody, judges, probation officers, clients, providers, family members, really understand what it was that we were trying to accomplish. It really is a communications portion of the work that we're doing. We can't just build up a diversion program and expect everybody to know what we're doing and what we're trying to achieve. Next slide. Again, cross-training on roles is something that's really critical. This is from a paper that I published several years ago, really trying to look at when you're sitting there working with treatment providers and you have correctional supervisory partners like probation or parole, sometimes there's confusion over who's supposed to do what. And it's really important to sit down and understand who you're working for, what the roles and responsibilities are, and then also how does cross-collaboration work, given those roles and responsibilities. Next slide. And all these slides I'm sure will be made available to you if you want to look at them more closely. So that's really what diversion programs are about, is really thinking about not just looking at the behavioral health traditional framework, but rethinking that behavioral health framework to combining what works in substance use services, what works in mental health treatment, how we think about recidivism reduction, to really emphasize that recovery framework takes into account all of those elements. Next slide. And you may be hearing more about this, but to do this, it really requires you to think about what level of services people need, both from the criminogenic side as well as from the substance use mental health side. In other words, you might have people that have significant functional impairment from their mental illness or their substance use, or from both, but they're really at low risk to reoffend in a major way. And so how you provide those supports and how you work with criminal legal partners and probation, for example, should take into account what the needs of the individual are. And so where you have people with both high criminogenic risk and high mental health and substance use needs, you really need to have your behavioral health system and your criminal system locked in step, working together to achieve mutual goals. If you don't have those high level of needs, then you can kind of modify how your behavioral health system and your criminal legal system work together. Next slide. Also thinking about stabilizers, you know, really this is from Faye Taxman's work, from some work she put together in 2018, where she really focuses on stabilizers that are factors that increase the likelihood of success. And as opposed to just looking at criminogenic risk, like thinking about what are stabilizers. Family support can be a stabilizer as much as if you don't have it, it can be a destabilizer, for example. Employment, education, really minimizing criminal networks, really focusing on stable housing. Next slide. And then she also talks about these destabilizers and really thinking about the criminogenic risk factors if they're high as destabilizing influences, the lack of family support, the lack of education, the less than full-time employment, unstable housing. And so as you're building out your diversion strategies for your programs, you want to think about maximizing stabilizers and minimizing destabilizers to achieve that community tenure that I spoke about in my first slide. Next slide. You also have to take into account trauma, of course. The adverse childhood events is one of the ways that we measure early experience of trauma prior to the age of 18, but you could be dealing with, and you will be dealing with individuals who are also dealing with adult traumatic circumstances. And we know that people with trauma histories are going to have a lot of disrupted personality development possibilities, which might mean that they have they're more prone to irritability, they're more prone to hypervigilance. They might be more prone to having difficulties forming attachments and may seem a little bit more antisocial in their approach or more volatile in their approaches to things. And so we really have to make sure that we're taking into account for any program that we build in that trauma lens that understands where people are coming from and really tries to meet them where they're at and works to the best of our ability to help people maximize their pro-social thinking, attitudes, and behaviors. Next slide. Again, we just know from data that there's going to be high levels of trauma histories in the individuals that you're going to be serving. And so knowing that means that we have to really think about universal precautions when it comes to being aware of trauma in people's backgrounds and then trying to build services around and supporting people's needs around potentially trauma-specific therapies, but at the very least, trauma-informed approaches. Next slide. You're going to hear more about this later, but the criminogenic risks and needs framework is going to be really important as you think about really building in for people with co-occurring conditions and criminogenic needs, really building in approaches that focus on what those needs are. For example, I mentioned impulsivity. If that comes from trauma, then we might need to really think about stress management, yoga, problem solving, trauma-specific therapies to help people really decrease some of those tendencies that look like criminogenic needs. And so building out treatment planning around that is going to be important. Next slide. Of course, we want to think about person-centered approaches and not just labeling people as high, medium, and low risk, but really trying to understand what are the ways to help mitigate those risks on an individualized basis and understanding their goals and our goals and how do we mutually attain those goals together. Next slide. Harm reduction is another important piece, which is not just thinking about, moving past a positive talk screen, but really thinking about how do we maximize the ability of individuals to build safety networks, to really think about if they do have relapses, how we support them through that relapse to help them move towards their recovery journey. Next slide. And of course, we want to think about this vital, what we call the vital role of the continuum of care. We recognize, everyone recognizes that individuals with substance use disorders and chronic mental illness really are going to have periods of time in their life where they're going to have relapses and periods of time where they can be more stable recovery. And during the times where they have greater needs, we want to make sure that there is a continuum of care available to them. So as you're setting up your diversion planning, again, you want to make sure that you have that fallback of the inpatient hospitalization, the acute system. You want to make sure that they have primary care set up for their medical needs, and really building in that continuum of care for planning for when they're both stable and when their needs are greater, so that you have that baked into your entire diversion strategy. Next slide. I think that's where I end in talking about how do we build in successful components of diversionary strategies, and I will turn it back over to Ashley at this point.
Thank you, Dr. Prinals. So we want to pause here for a second and see if there are any questions out in the audience for Dr. Prinals. You can send questions in through the chat if you'd like, or you can use the raise hand function to raise your hand, and we can call on you and unmute you, and go ahead and give it a moment or two, give people a chance to think if they have any questions, and get them into the chat box.
And I know you'll be thinking in your breakout groups about your programs and services. And so hopefully this is giving you some food for thought about that.
Okay, it looks like we have a question, couple questions. We want one, where will the PowerPoint be available? I will be sending the PowerPoint out after the end of our presentations today to everybody who's registered. So that will be coming out to you all early this evening. And a second question asking, and I think this may be actually directed to DSH, whether we recommend that counties develop MOUs. And yes, we certainly do. In any, if there are areas where that level of agreement needs to be made within your stakeholder group, if you don't already have an established kind of working relationship between your various partners, or in particular, we are going to require the collection of both behavioral health and criminal justice data for this project, and that's going to need to come into us. So if you need to put together some kind of data sharing agreement amongst the partners as well in order to facilitate that part of the project, then that is definitely something your county should be thinking about. We also have a question about sample MOUs that we can perhaps share. And yes, we do, I think, have a few examples from our current counties that are working with us that we can share, I believe, with you all. So we'll see what our team can pull together to send out to the group. Another question about housing funds. How do we know of any small counties who have successfully deployed housing? And if so, how they are able to fund it? So that is a great question, and actually one that we are going to tackle specifically on Wednesday at our next session. So I'm going to actually put a pin in that question and save it for Wednesday, because the entire day of Wednesday is devoted to housing. All right. All right, and another question, more DSH, about sharing other flow charts. I'm not sure what a P&P is. Maybe that's PowerPoint. We do have a number of pre-recorded webinars that were given to our prior counties as they were going through the same process. Policies and procedures, thank you for clarifying. We do have various examples that we've collected from our current counties that we can reach out to them and see if we can share that with you all. All right. All right, so I think with that, we will move on to our next section of today's presentation. So welcoming Dr. Sarah Desmarais.
Great, thanks everyone. I'm going to be picking up on a few of the different concepts that Deb just walked us through, and I'm also going to be picking up on a few things that we went through last time that I just sort of introduced as concepts, and now we're going to build on as it relates to risk assessment in this context. Next slide, please. So to start with a recap of what we did last time, next slide, please. I wanted to remind people how we were conceptualizing a risk assessment in this context or in any context more generally. So when I talk about risk assessment, it's really talking about a process as opposed to an end product. So it's not a thing, it's something that we do. And in this process, it's about looking at a bunch of different factors that are associated with threats to public safety, and we'll get into some of the definitional issues there. And as Deb mentioned, these factors can be risk factors, things that increase the likelihood of the adverse outcome. They can be protective or mitigating factors, things that will reduce the likelihood of the adverse outcomes or buffer the effects of these risk factors. And those can take various different forms. So they can be stabilizing factors. We can have destabilizing factors. We also can consider different ways that these factors might work and function for the individual. So they might also be motivating factors or factors that affect or demotivate the individual. We can also think about things that will promote or reduce the likelihood of positive treatment outcomes. So there's lots of different ways that we can think about how factors are associated for any given individual with these threats to public safety. It's a complicated process, so we know from the research that it is going to be more accurate, more transparent, and more consistent if we can use some sort of structured strategy to do that. And it will pull together this information to help us estimate the likelihood and severity of what it is that we think will happen in the future. Then, based on that information, the idea is that we're going to use it to inform decisions, and we'll talk about what those decisions might be in the context of mental health diversion. But also that in those decisions, part of what we're thinking through is what do we do to mitigate those risks and really promote positive outcomes for both the individual, your community, and the program. And then finally, the process of risk assessment is just not a one-off. It's something that we're going to have to do continually over time. And so again, there seems to be value and an opportunity to use a structured approach that will assist you in these complex tasks. Next slide, please. So just to reiterate, one of the things that you'll need to consider when you're going in and doing these mental health diversion programs and making decisions about who ought to be in your program is really about balancing this idea of public safety, individual outcomes, also considering what resources are available in their community. So we know that the process of doing all of these things, this is part of what the task is. So it's going to happen whether or not you use a structured risk assessment instrument. So what I'm encouraging you to consider is that the role of having a structured risk assessment instrument is going to help inform but not replace any of the decisions that you have to make in these contexts. And in doing so, you're really going to support what we consider to be legally defensible decision making. So again, it's not that it's going to change what you're doing, but rather inform and support it, and that it allows you to say that based on the best evidence and what is accepted as a state of the practice, that this is what we thought would happen, acknowledging that there's always going to be things that happen that we couldn't have anticipated. But here we want to set you all up to be able to do so and make these decisions in the most defensible way possible. Next slide, please. So to that end, here's kind of that cycle I just talked you through. Next slide, please. And here in the first piece, risk assessment instruments can help us really increase the structure, the transparency, and the accuracy and consistency with which we're making these decisions. Next slide, please. They can help provide information that will support these defensible decisions. Next slide, please. And then finally, they can help provide us with information that will really help hone in. This is complicated. There is a lot going on, especially as Deb was talking about with high-risk, high-need individuals. So this is a strategy to really help make your job easier and think about what do we need to do to ensure the safety of the community and also promote the best outcomes for the individual. Next slide, please. Finally, if you're using a structured risk assessment instrument, you're going to be able to produce findings, especially if you're using one that includes dynamic risk factors and protective factors, meaning factors that can change over time. If you're using an instrument that has that built in, that has that capacity to document and identify change, that's a real kind of built-in strategy then to be able to look at how change is happening over time. So we can look at it in consideration of all of the different things that we might be doing with the individuals, right? So whatever those treatment and risk management strategies might be, hopefully those are helping to reduce the likelihood of adverse outcome, but it also gives us an opportunity in a very structured and routine fashion to look at if there are changes occurring that might change our safety level, that might change our decision making about where this person needs to be and what level and type of services they need. Next slide, please. So that is really a lot of what we've talked about already. So what I wanted to just spend a few minutes today talking about is how do we then translate or use these assessment results in a way that informs what you do day to day in the context of a mental health diversion program. Next slide, please. And forward, thank you. So the first thing I wanted to talk about here is the risk-need responsivity model. It's the way that I like, and I have shared with many of you all already, the strategy for really taking what is perhaps a complicated or difficult to understand assessment process and really putting it into practice. So the risk-need responsivity model is considered a best practice for assessing and treating people who become involved in the criminal legal system. Advance, please. There is an abundance of research, truly decades of research at this point, that we are able to mitigate risk and improve public safety and case outcomes with adherence to three principles that I'm going to talk about today. The risk principle, the need principle, and then the next one, the responsivity principle. Next slide, please. Thanks. So the risk principle is first about how do we identify the appropriate level of care and intervention. So we're having to make decisions about where people go. Are they eligible for participation in diversion? Do we have the resources we need to keep them and others safe in the community? Next slide, please. So if we can advance to get the bullets on the slide, thanks. Always the challenge of having somebody else run your slides. Okay, so here, when we're talking about the risk principle, we're really talking about matching a level of intensity and a frequency of supervision and services. So we're not yet honing in on what are those appropriate supervision strategies and services. We're talking more about what level of risk does this person present, and essentially how much work, how many resources do we need to have available to be able to work with them and promote safety. So what I'm going to try to convince for you all today is that mental health diversion is really a very pretty intense level of supervision and service. So we're looking here to be focusing on people who are at higher risk and therefore for whom we do need to have more resources, more intensity, and more frequent supervision and services. If we have people who are lower risk, we really should be doing less work with those individuals. When we're identifying folks as being low risk on risk assessment tools, we're essentially saying that these individuals are probably going to be fine on their own, but this is not a person for whom we have concerns about their public safety and the likelihood of negative outcomes in the community. And so for that reason, I'm going to strongly encourage you to stay away from only wanting to divert people and use the resources of this mental health diversion program for these lower risk individuals. And there's a couple different reasons for that. So the first and kind of most compelling is that research shows when we over or under intervene with somebody, we actually can lead to worse outcomes. So when there's a mismatch between an individual's level of risk and the level of intensity and frequency of supervision and services, we essentially make things worse. So that makes conceptual sense if we have somebody who, let's say, is high risk and we don't have enough supervision and services. But what's going on when you have somebody that's low risk and you over-intervene? And there's very consistent and compelling evidence that over-intervening is especially problematic when we're talking about people who would do pretty well on their own. And there's two reasons for this. The first is when you're over-intervening, you're actually increasing the risk factors that they have. So you're actually increasing the reasons that they will engage in negative outcomes, and in particular, in risk of public safety towards others, right? So why is that something that might happen? The first thing could be that if we're over-restricting a person, so if we're not giving access to certain things and we're increasing a level of restriction and potentially moving folks from a less secure to a more secure setting, we can augment, for example, their feelings of anger. When we have somebody with serious mental illnesses, we know that we can also exacerbate any symptoms that might be associated with that mental illness. We also can put them in a peer group where it's more beneficial for them to engage in more risky behaviors. So in other words, the pro-social strategies or the pro-social behaviors that might be successful in a community are going to be different behaviors that might than what they have to do, for example, if they're in a jail or a prison setting to keep themselves safe and to sort of fit in with the peer group. So there's a lot of different ways that over-intervening can actually increase the individual's risk factors and make them worse. At the same time, when we're over-intervening, we can ultimately be reducing what protective factors they might have had in their environment. One really powerful stabilizing protective factor is having people around them in their social network, positive peers, pro-social family members, important relationships. Those are all really important factors to help increase the likelihood of a positive illness trajectory. For people who are justice involved, those factors are also really important predictors of desistance from crime, so of not engaging in criminal behavior anymore. These are things that help structure and support the individual, and when they get pulled away from those things, we are losing perhaps naturally occurring resources and protective factors that they might have had in their environment. So all that to say, when we're using risk assessment in the context of mental health diversion programs, we should be looking for people who need and require a higher level of supervision and services, a level of resourcing that is commensurate with the level of resourcing that is going to be afforded to them in the context of this program. So the last thing that I'll say about this is that there's pretty clear legal definitions around the fact that risk assessment results should be used to inform a minimum level of care as opposed to the other way around. So we should be using risk assessment results to help us understand what is that least restrictive environment and what resources would need to be there in that environment to ensure a person's success, okay? So the only other thing I wanted to say about the risk principle is that even when we talk about high risk or moderate risk, these are very vague terms. They're very broad. They don't mean much. When we're talking about moderate or high risk, we're usually looking at still quite low base rate behaviors. So in other words, people who are at moderate or high risk still engage in violence and crime at levels that we would probably think, most of us, are lower than expected. So there's been some survey work by my research group and others that have looked at, like, when we say high risk, what do you think that means? And people usually say it's something like 75, 85, 90% of those people engage in violence and crime. Well, when in fact, in reality, the rate with which people in those groups actually engage in those behaviors are much lower than even 50%. So I don't want you to get caught up in thinking that high risk means, yes, this person is going to do the thing that we're worried about. It just means that in relation to other people, they are at increased likelihood, okay? Our job then is to go and move into the next principle, the need principle, to say, all right, we said these folks are at higher risk. What are we now going to do to ensure that it doesn't happen? Okay, and I think we talked about this a bit already. So the first thing here, like I said, is going to be program eligibility. So let's try to identify those people for whom they do need the level of resources that comes along with mental health diversion, and then ensuring that in the case management, we're kind of matching or balancing the setting, the frequency, and the intensity of services that will help them stay safe. Okay, next slide, please. So moving into the need principle, here now we're talking about what do we do to promote positive outcomes and ensure community safety and the safety of the individual. Okay, if you could fill this slide in, sorry. Here I wanted to talk about two things. We want to focus in this population on both criminogenic and behavioral health needs, and that is something that Deb talked about as well. So criminogenic here, we mean related to crime, and behavioral health, of course, we mean related to mental health issues, substance use issues. What we know just from common sense, but also bearing out in the research, is that when we have folks who have identified needs, if we have treatment, if we have services that target those needs for that person, we're going to see improved outcomes. So the example I like to give all the time is around anger, right? So if somebody is engaging in violence and gets put into an anger management program, well, if their violence had nothing to do with anger, so if they weren't motivated to engage in violence because of anger, perhaps it was more about maybe a strategy for power and control, or maybe it was a symptom of their serious mental illness. If they're not engaging in violence because of anger, if we put them in an anger management program, they might learn how to manage their anger, but that's not going to then have any kind of effect on the rate with which they engage in violence. So that all makes sense, but when we start to get into programs where we might have limited services and referral options, we really start to see a mismatch between what is this person's needs and what are the things that we can do with them and that we have available. So I want to strongly encourage us not to put people into diversion, for example, if they have, let's say, a primary substance use disorder and need very intensive substance use treatment in the community, and that's just not available in the community. That would be a very poor match with what the program is designed to do. I'm also going to encourage you to think and focus in here on dynamic. I used that language already. So factors that can actually change, especially in the short term. So as we're planning in, say, months or quarters, let's focus in on those tangible things that we can make change with, right? So Deb talked about like a housing first model, or what are the things that we need to do first that if we get that to change, then we can work on bigger picture issues. The other thing that I would really strongly encourage you to do as you're making decisions about referrals and services is to not always focus on the history. So that's what I mean by distal. I want to really encourage you to focus on how is this person doing now? How have they been doing recently to get a better understanding of what you will need in place in the short term? Yes, the old saying of, history of violence predicts future violence, that is true, but only if you're considering a person's entire lifespan. So if you're considering about whether somebody will ever recidivate, will ever engage in future criminal behavior, well, sure, then you can look at their criminal history. But what's really going to be telling about how they're going to behave, whether they're going to engage in criminal behavior in the next, say, 3 months, is really how they've been doing in the last 3 months. What do we know about how they're currently doing, and what are those things that we can change that can be targeted in treatment? Next slide, please. So here, I just really want to share that there's a lot of information out there on this notion of criminogenic needs. And I want to just ensure that all of the folks on the Diversion Academy today and your colleagues, that there is a real need in diversion programs to focus on criminogenic needs, those things that increase the rate of crime in people with serious mental illnesses, but also in other populations, right? So this could be things like criminal attitudes, antisocial peers, things like that. But I want you to also remember that in this mental health diversion program, one of the criteria for participation is that their symptoms of severe mental illness are part of why they have to be involved in the program, right? So their symptoms have to be related to the criminal behavior. So I just wanted to remind folks of that. Next slide, please. I think I probably touched on most of here. Because we're focusing on treatment and intervention, I also just wanted to give some examples of programs that are designed specifically to address criminogenic needs, but that we know have been adapted and validated for use with a population of people with serious mental illnesses. So they've made changes to these programs to make them more workable and to be more responsive, which we'll talk about in a minute, to the needs of this particular population. And I'd be happy to share resources or links to any of these programs. Some are in the public domain and others do need to be purchased or to have training on them. Okay, next slide, please. So finally, the responsivity principle, as I alluded to on the last slide, is like, how do we now ensure that what we're doing with this person, taking a very person-centric approach, is going to have the greatest possibility of positive outcomes. Next slide, please. So here with the responsivity principle, what we want to say is how do we tailor intervention strategies so that we can promote positive responses, that we afford the ability to monitor progress, and that we can really see changes over time. And so here, what this also requires us to think about is that what we're doing at the beginning of somebody's trajectory or participation in a program might be different than what we do later. So let's imagine we have somebody who's coming in who has come off a fairly acute psychotic episode, who is not quite yet stable. We might need a lot of structuring in the early days of their participation in the mental health diversion program, right? We might need more intensive intervention, more frequent supervision. But hopefully, as they progress over time and they start to gain some stability and have some success in the community and in treatment, we might be able to then revisit their risk assessment and say, we don't need to be doing this in the same way anymore. We can scale back our work with them and also structure and support them to be more successful and have greater autonomy on their own. So, you know, the whole idea about mental health diversion is that we think that they will do better in the community, that we might be able to promote positive change in their functioning and in their behavior. And in doing so, we have to also be ready to say, hey, they might change over time. So what we did with them in the first few months is not what we should be doing in months 12 or months 24. A couple other things about responsivity just to mention. There's two different ideas here. There's general responsivity, meaning that across a population of people, we know that there are certain strategies that are going to be more successful. Cognitive social learning strategies are certainly one that we know have very good treatment evidence behind that. And here, some of the ideas about pro-social behaviors that they view and see from others, right? So if we're showing and role modeling, as well as treatment providers and other people they interact with, that's going to be a more positive strategy. And we're also going to want to really structure and skill build over time in a way that will promote the likelihood of a positive outcome. We also do want to be responsive to characteristics of the individual, of their circumstances, and also of the system that they're in. So there could be aspects of a person's history, of their identities that we want to be responsive to and make sure that we're engaging with them in this work in a way that will help that individual be successful. It might not be the same way that it would be successful for this individual over here. So we just need to be okay with the idea that we'll have to do a more person-centered strategy. Next slide, please. And this is our last one, so we'll get us to break. But I just wanted to say a few things about this idea in diversion. So all participants will have serious mental illnesses by definition, by criteria, right? This is what we're looking at. Most will have current symptoms. It is not, I think, realistic to assume that everybody in jail before they come to mental health diversion is going to have complete resolution of symptoms and be all stable. I don't even think that's required. I think that it's more likely that we should be ready for and anticipate that people will have current symptoms. Some may even have acute symptoms. It doesn't mean that they're necessarily too high risk or too dangerous or too unstable. Rather, what we need to do is create the strategies, be responsive to how do we structure this individual so that they can be successful in the community. Because frankly, the jail is not the place that we should be focused on treating them and having them be successful. We want them to be able to be successful in the community ultimately. And here, so just a few other things, is that we want to use a stepwise strategy that of course prioritizes public safety, but nonetheless also focuses in on how do we address those acute symptoms so we can build the stability for them to be successful over time. Acknowledging, as Deb said, that we're really going to be doing a harm reduction approach here. So with this population, especially with people who are heavily system involved and have been for a long time, it's not realistic to say they're never going to engage in criminal behavior again. They're never going to need another hospitalization. Instead, really for us, success is going to be about increasing the amount of time that they're able to have that community tenure, the length of time that they're able to receive services and can have continuous care, rather than thinking about this as yes, no, are they going to recidivate? It's really about lengthening that time in the community. All right, and that is my last slide. So I think, Ashley, I'll leave it to you as to whether we're doing questions or going to breakout rooms.
It looks like the next thing on our agenda is actually to go into a case vignette review and panel discussion. So Katie, do you want me to hand it over to you now?
Sure. I actually think first we were going to have a break until 2:25. Should we still do that, or should we just keep rolling?
Yeah, we should take the break. Why don't we, would it be okay if we push it out to 2:30 just to give everybody at least 10 minutes?
Yeah, that's a good idea.
Okay, everybody. We are going to go to break. All right, everybody, welcome back. We're going to get started with our next section, but before I hand it over to Katie, just a quick request. If you are having any technical difficulties or if you have questions that you want to send in for the panelists to respond to, can you please make sure that you're sending the chat to all panelists and not just the host? Unfortunately, because I am managing the slides for today's presentation, I'm not able to respond as quickly, particularly if you are having technical issues. So if you can send those into all panelists, somebody else from the team may be able to help you more quickly than I am able to. All right, Katie, over to you.
Thank you, Ashley. Yeah, so now, I mean, we just got so much incredible information from Deb and Sarah, but now we want to make it a little more like tangible and concrete and talk through some of the case vignettes that we talked about during our last session. And, you know, we'll ask Deb and Sarah and Sean and others to kind of weigh in about what these cases would look like in terms of treatment planning, risk assessment, etc. If I could have the next slide, please. So this is Jim, who we talked about in our last session. I'm not going to reread this, but he was the man who was arrested for entering a student's apartment and rifling through the woman's backpack, while she was home, he was very psychotic and disorganized at the time of his arrest, but he was not aggressive or agitated or violent. He exhibited a lot of negative symptoms, very flat affect, disorganized speech, didn't make eye contact with his attorney during his arraignment, etc. He overall, though, was pleasant, polite, and cooperative. He was prescribed schizophrenia and was prescribed an injectable antipsychotic medication while he was incarcerated. He had very limited insight, but he was able to understand that medications were beneficial to him and that he was able to verbalize that he would continue to take medication. He had lived with his family his entire life, and they were able and willing to have him come back to living with him if he was released to diversion. Prior to his arrest, he had a private psychiatrist, but he was not very engaged or compliant, and he had a history of hospitalization. This was his first and only arrest, and he had no self-reported or documented history of substance use or abuse. So Deb, I mean, looking at someone like Jim and thinking about, what you were just talking about in terms of treatment services, what would you suggest or recommend for someone like Jim in terms of diversion treatment services? Deb, are you there? Okay. Maybe she's having some issues. I'm going to ask Sean from DSH. If you're looking at someone like Jim, what would you think about in terms of wanting to see for treatment services, from your perspective at DSH's diversion program?
Yeah, thank you so much. What really strikes me, with this vignette is just his need for continued psychopharmacological stabilization and, an increase in those frequencies and intensities of meeting. I'm really thinking of the information that Sarah gave in terms of the risk principle, and really thinking about how often, what the frequency and intensity of those interactions with different treatment providers would be, in moving forward with his treatment and so forth. I also just wanted to say, because obviously probably meeting every 3 months is not what's best for him. I also just want to say, given that Jim has no substance use history, he's fairly pleasant. I think we talked about this last time. Although he may not have insights, he's doing the work, he's participating in treatment, he's compliant, and so forth. I think Jim is someone who, if I were a county looking for someone to put in my diversion program, I think Jim is a fantastic candidate for that. I think he would, do very well with that kind of stabilization and so forth. So I would say look for the Jims, for inclusion and diversion. Sarah, do you have any thoughts, or would you want to add anything? Or I don't know if Deb's back.
Yeah, Sean, thanks. I'll add a few things. So I think, on the surface, a felony burglary can look kind of scary as an index charge, right, as a charging offense. And he is very mentally ill, but as Sean said, I think really what we could have is more frequent and less intensive touch, right? So as long as we saw him more frequently, and when I say we or you, it wouldn't have to be just about the one, primary provider. It could be something like, I could see for him something like positive peer support being valuable, right? So if there were different ways that we could have somebody checking in on him, specifically more so than just, certainly once every 3 months, even probably more than once a week, just to touch base and really remind him. He doesn't seem to be showing any kind of pushback on the plan. He seems very agreeable, but that he does need a lot of that reminding. So yeah, I mean, probably if I were to do an assessment with him, he'd land somewhere in the moderate range because of his serious mental illness, his history. But he would be really, to echo what you said, Sean, like a perfect candidate. Look for the gyms.
Thank you. Deb, are you able
Yeah.
to?
Yeah,
Speak?
I
Oh,
would
great,
add,
thank you.
yeah, I would add a few things to what Sarah said, and that is, you know, first of all, we know from ACT and from ICM that more touch points, and from critical time intervention, that more touch points in the beginning can be really important as people are going through transition. So when you start to engage somebody early on, you saw the data that I showed you from one of our programs that showed that engagement in the beginning is tough, but it's almost more important then to double down on your efforts. And the other thing I would say is, in the work that I've been doing, is really looking more intentionally at what that touch point should look like. I think you're absolutely right that it doesn't need to be a deep touch, but you need to give your peers and your case managers structure to what you expect from the touch point. Is it just a phone call to say, hey, how you doing, because you're trying to build and get engagement or alliance, or is it to check on what's happening with their family, what might be going on with a custody issue? And so in a lot of the case consults that I've been involved in diversion programs, we're really trying to be very literal with the line staff around what we expect of that touch point, because otherwise they don't know. And so, you know, if you kind of keep your big goals in mind for your treatment plan, and that's why we really like to develop those treatment plans that are really specific about meet with the client twice to talk about engagement in local community volunteer activities, you know, to do pro-social, whatever. You know, meet with the client twice to talk about how they're doing with cravings, so that people really know what the point is of the visit and it's not just a general visit. I think there's a lot to be said about structuring the conversations in a certain way around a certain topic.
Thank you, Deb. I've mentioned this before to a lot of different people, but when I was working on a fact team in New York City, one of my supervisors drilled into us that she would just say, like, no check-ins. Like, we are not here to do check-ins. We're here to provide treatment. She didn't want to see any notes that started with, I checked in with Jim today. No. So we'd have these meetings. She'd say, no check-ins. She's British, so she had this, like, funny accent. But that's, like, ingrained in my head. Like, you don't start a note or anywhere in a note with, I checked in, because that's not treatment. And that's such a vague term. So.
Well, and in fact, you know, Medicaid that bills for general case management services, it's a rehab options Medicaid service. So you have to show how what you're doing is tied to the rehabilitative goal. So even if you're taking somebody out, you know, to help them go to the grocery, that has to be shown as part of their rehabilitation plan. And so I think that's, you know, these are going to be funded in different ways, but it's a good habit to get into, to think about what's a billable code, what's the purpose of your work. I hope you could hear me. I hope that wasn't me that froze.
I can hear you, Deb.
Okay. I think Katie may be having some problems.
Yeah, Katie might be frozen. So while we're waiting to see if Katie can get reconnected, is there anybody else on our panel here? We do have our partners from Kern County on the call. I don't know if either of you, Sherry or Stephanie, would like to kind of weigh in on this particular vignette, if what you kind of would see for this individual if they were in your treatment program.
Hi, this is Sherry from Kern. Can you hear me?
Yes.
So the first thing that came to mind was the frequency of visits. I know that was mentioned earlier, but especially the psychiatric appointments. So every 3 months, I'll just say, is really unheard of, even in our program. we start off with psychiatric visits every 30 days, and we can make them sooner. So every 3 months is kind of a stretch, I think. And then the frequency of visits as far as the services provided. Again, we're working a FACT model, so if we need to see the individuals every day, and it sounds like a lot of engagement and building rapport with this individual would be helpful. And so starting off with quite a few visits, more frequent visits, and then slowing down or pulling back as he gets more familiar with the TE.
Excellent, thank you. And I think we may still be missing Katie. So why don't we go ahead and move to...
Actually, if I could interject really quick, I just noticed there was a question in the chat. So I'll throw this out to the panel. The question is, what if Jim doesn't want to take the medication, but he is willing to comply with counseling and other plans of diversion? Many clients don't want to take meds. Is someone like this at risk of not being deemed successful in diversion? Any thoughts from our panel?
I have a lot of thoughts about that. I would want to understand what his reason is for not wanting to take the medicine. Are there legitimate side effects that he's concerned about? Has he had legitimate problems with the medicine? Is the dosing a pain in the neck? If you give me an antibiotic that I have to take 3 times a day, I will not take it 3 times a day. I always forget a dose. So can we change the dosing around to make it more useful? Would he be willing to get it, if an injectable medication is appropriate, would a long-acting injectable make it more likely that he would adhere? So I think medication adherence, is a really big deal to really understand why people don't want their medicines, and there can be so many reasons. The other thing is, and I don't know fully the laws in California, but is there a conservator that has to be appointed because he lacks the decision-making capacity, which is different than competence to stand trial. But if he needs an alternative decision maker, then how is that person engaged in care? If that person can be helpful in helping encourage the adherence, that's another thing. And then, really trying to continue to work on it. Oftentimes you can't move people into a hospital setting unless they're really showing symptoms that require that hospital level of care. And so you're really working on engagement strategies and meeting people with where they're at. But what we find is that with really positive engagement, a lot of the non-adherence does go away. It's just we've always rushed to these coercive interventions, and always in everything in life, we keep thinking coercion is the absolute way to get everybody to where we want them, but it doesn't always work. So I guess I would really want to understand, bring in a consultant, show the patient that you care, really try to understand what the problems are with the medicines and whether there's alternative medicines that they would be willing to take, and whether there's family or an alternative decision maker that can help support their decision making.
Thank you. I'm sorry, I was having some connectivity issues, but I'm here now. Thank you so much. And yeah, just for me looking at Jim also, I mean, you've already talked about this, but it seems like some family psychoeducation would be really helpful. Sorry, I have some feedback. That also, it seems like their family didn't quite understand the importance of his medication compliance and treatment engagement. Also, I think Sarah and Deb mentioned some positive pro-social activities, maybe a psychosocial clubhouse, volunteering, just to prevent some of that isolation. And like Sarah mentioned before about, the need to not over-supervise or, over-monitor people that are relatively moderate to low risk. Someone who has no documented history of substance use or reported history, they don't need to be drug tested twice a week, obviously, but sometimes I think people think, oh, well, they're in diversion, we have to, drug test everybody consistently. Yes, it's probably always good to do toxicologies here and there, or if you have suspicion that someone may be using, but, you know, having someone like Jim come into your office twice a week to get drug tested isn't really a good use, I would argue, of anyone's time or resources when really there's other people that need kind of intense supervision.
Yeah, I would add to that, Katie, just one more thoughts as you all were talking. The first is that, you know, to Deb's point, I think there would be a lot to be said, even just for the value from a therapeutic alliance point of view of asking about the resistance and kind of, you know, using that motivational interviewing principle of rolling with the resistance and really trying to understand and meet the individual where they are in terms of, you know, their desire or not for the medication. And then, you know, to the degree that you may or may not want to do any substance use screens with this individual, I would just say that that would potentially be, you know, even more harmful if you're trying to build rapport and trust and use that as a strategy to get them to buy into the reasons they might want to actually take their medication, then doing things that might suggest that you don't trust them, that you don't believe what they're saying, really could be quite detrimental. And I would just, you know, echo the powers of persuasion. So if they say the peers, you know, in a clubhouse model who are taking their meds and not resisting, if they have a peer support person who's assigned to them potentially who can kind of talk about that with them, and, you know, to whatever degree it might be possible that they are willing to take meds, but maybe not for the reasons that we want them to, for other reasons, and to just have a positive case outcome. So, yeah, just a couple other thoughts.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Thank you for that. And it also goes back to, like we talked at the very beginning, you know, making sure you have close, like, stakeholder engagement and, like, understanding of what diversion is, because if a judge expects, well, everybody's going to be drug tested twice a week in this program, that's how it's going to be, you know, being able to educate the judge and the DA or a defense attorney about, you know, why each person needs an individualized plan and needs to be person-centered. That can be easier said than done, but why it's so important to have that close communication from the beginning. Great. If we could have, yes.
Katie, I was also going to mention, this is Sherry's concern.
Mm-hmm.
I was also going to mention that educating the family is really important, and that was mentioned. We also have a family advocate that's part of our patients' rights office that we get involved to help, you know, meet with the family and help them, educate them and understand the behavioral health issues or the substance use issues, and that in turn, you know, kind of builds that support for the individual.
Thank you, Sherry. Yeah, Sherry is, we mentioned her, she's in Kern County, and we're going to hear from her, but that's really helpful. Thank you. If we could have the next slide, please. So I'm going to preface this. That Lisa is quite a complicated case, and we have kind of limited time to talk through this, but she was the case we talked about during our last session, who was arrested for arson after attempting to set a fire in a Walgreens store and talking about demons that were following and chasing her. A fire did not start, but it could have. She had a very long history of psychiatric instability. She was diagnosed with schizoaffective disorder. She'd been hospitalized multiple times. She had a history of crack cocaine and marijuana use, and she had been abstinent from cocaine for the last 15 years, but did continue to use marijuana. She has a history of homelessness. She had a prior felony conviction for assaulting court officers in the past, and she was unfit to proceed for that case and was sent to the state hospital for restoration. And after the restoration, she was ultimately sentenced to prison for that charge. So again, there's a lot going on here, but I mean, Deb, what would you say are like your initial thoughts about a treatment plan or treatment recommendation for someone like Lisa? You might be muted, Deb, if you're speaking.
Sorry about that.
Oh, no, it's okay.
Yeah, I mean, there is a lot that's going on for her. I really still think the first part of a treatment plan is figuring out the engagement strategy. to get her to be willing to work with you and to see what her goals are in terms of what she wants to accomplish in the community, so that she's not just keeps cycling back and forth. Because until you meet people with where they're at and figure out why they would want to be out of the jail, you know, you're going to constantly be, you're not going to be aligned. You're going to be kind of going at it from your point of view, but really it's their point of view that's going to drive behaviors. So I'd really want the treatment plan would be sitting down and spending time figuring out goals for Lisa. I'd want to understand where she's at with her symptoms. You know, she was stabilized on a long-acting injectable medication and mood stabilizers. It's not clear to me. Maybe I missed it. Is she still on those? Is she not on those? Did they change the diagnosis in the jail? You know, do I need to gather treatment records to make sure I have the long view of her? And even though from a maybe risk, as Sarah was saying before, you know, we want to look at what the risk is now. From a diagnostic standpoint, we also need to see what's been going on for her for a long time to understand what medicines would be helpful, what medicines wouldn't be. Hopefully she's somebody that can tell you about the medicines that have been most helpful for her, but you really are going to want to look at some old records and know what you're dealing with. You've got a person, too, with an arson history. We talked about this last time. I mean, that's a scary charge for the community. It may be that it was not a big deal in a way, and it was just that's what the charge was. So you have to understand what those risk variables are as you're trying to develop that treatment plan. So, for example, you know, if it was a deliberate arson, was it because she has some pyromania? Was it because she was psychotic and just hearing these voices, and now she's not hearing those voices? So I think you're going to have to really assess what was going on with that to try and help the court see that you're mitigating the risk going forward.
Thank you. And Sarah, what are just your quick thoughts about a case like this in terms of risk assessment?
Yes, I'll summarize her last 20 years in a few minutes. No, I think just to echo a couple of things that I saw in the case that Deb was asking about. So I did see something that was actually promising. So in jail, she was agreeing to take the medications, first resistant, and then started to agree. And so that gives me some promise, and it does seem like her arson was in the context of a serious psychotic episode. So with her, I think, you know, certainly she's going to show as high risk on, I'm sure, whatever assessment tool you would have done. But if we're able to put a lot of monitoring around her, I think a real key to success would be about keeping her stabilized on meds. If that violent behavior, that arson, is really about being in the kind of throes of that psychotic episode. I think the other thing that I saw in her history there was another violent charge against an officer when somebody approached her, like a security officer or something in court, and she reacted. And we see that a lot with folks with serious mental illness. So she, I think, bit the person. And so we have folks who are not you know, stable and who have symptoms. It would also be about understanding the approach that was used in that circumstance. And you know, when folks have the symptoms of paranoia and feeling like people are coming after them and they're being persecuted, and then indeed somebody does come after them, and you know, it's kind of a reasonable response, not the biting, but that there is you know, an escalation in that moment. So, you know, that was 5 years ago, I think, ish. Now the current issue was around this arson. I think that's what the instant offense was. And so I would say we're going to be talking about very intensive kind of community intervention and supervision, and really echoing what Deb said about kind of medication and ensuring that the symptoms are resolved.
Thank you. Sean, did you have anything quickly you wanted to add about Lisa?
Yeah, just totally agreeing with everything that's been mentioned. I can't remember if housing has been mentioned, but I think housing would be an important intervention for Lisa as well. You know, just as it seemed as though her homelessness was, you know, a part of the more distal dynamic factors just prior to her arrest. The other thing I just wanted to say, kind of going back to, we were talking about the responsivity, principle, and specifically the specific, responsivity principle. I'd be really interested if there were any kind of cultural considerations with LISA that may need to be explored. I'd also be interested in any sort of trauma history. And I guess just one kind of general statement that I always think about in doing risk assessment is to, always look for the strengths or the stabilizers, as Deb talked about earlier. I think those are always going to be your therapeutic levers to really, help motivate and sort of guide a person in their recovery. I think when we do risk assessment, being trained as a clinical forensic psychologist, I think we're, often trained to look at sort of the risks, and I think it's easy to overlook the strengths. And I would just say, in many ways, starting with the strengths and looking for those areas that you can really start to develop that therapeutic, that collaborative relationship with your, with your individual, with your clients you're working with.
Thank you, Sean. Great. So this was really excellent discussion. Now, can I see the next slide, please? We're going to have our breakout groups. Great, thank you. So you should have all received the treatment service inventory from Ashley, which is a form that you would all should have filled, well, each team should have filled out about what treatment services are available in your community as you're thinking about how to develop a diversion program. So in your breakout groups, we're going to first just review that. So someone in your group can just summarize what you've come up with. Then we're going to do, what we just modeled, but we're going to talk about Michael's case, and we'll show that on the screen in a second so you can be reminded. And again, think about in your community, what could you provide to Michael in terms of mental health services, supervision strategies, if he was going to participate in your diversion program. Could we see the next slide before we go into our groups, please? Yeah, so just a reminder, Michael was the man who was on the sidewalk yelling about ISIS and someone and other delusional things. Someone walked by him, tried to de-escalate him, and Michael punched him in the face. He had a few prior convictions for relatively minor things like petty larceny and riding the bus without payment. He had a history of outpatient mental health treatment in the past, but he wasn't fully compliant. He had a diagnosis of schizophrenia and was prescribed medication in the past, but wasn't consistently compliant. He was homeless at the time of his arrest. He had a history of marijuana and alcohol use, and he tested positive for both when he was arrested. He was agitated and delusional, but not physically aggressive or threatening, and he was able to express a commitment to re-engage in treatment. So yeah, so we'll send out 15 minutes, 12 minutes, 15 minutes in the breakout groups, and then we'll come back together and do some reporting out. So now Ashley is going to do some breakout magic.
Yes, everybody should be back.
Oh, thank you. So there were some technical glitches. I don't know what happened to my breakout group. There was no one there, but that's okay. We'll just go around, and if each, I'll facilitate it. Just want to summarize what you talked about in, just a couple minutes. That would be great. I guess I'll start with Hallie. Do you want to introduce who will be speaking from Madera County?
Sure. So we hadn't had a chance to go through the diversion and the community inventory yet, so that's what we spent our time doing. But maybe we can unmute Sally Moreno and Julie Morgan from Madera County to talk a little bit about what we talked about and some of the cross-pollination that came out of that conversation.
Yeah, go ahead, Julie.
Julie, can you hear me?
Yes.
Great. So we have not yet finished our spreadsheet, so we worked through that, and then Sally Moreno discussed some of our current veterans court and where some of the programming might be similar, and so how we might be able to tap into some of the MOUs and the workflows there, and maybe not reinvent the wheel and there, be able to utilize some of that information. We have some department heads getting together and working on that workflow in the next couple of weeks, and hopefully we'll be able to tap into that.
Well said.
Okay, great. No, that sounds productive. Great. I see that Ryan Caceres can report for Tulare County. So just for the sake of ease, do you want to unmute him, Ashley?
Wonderful job with my last name. So when we did our discussion, one of the things we talked about first was the inventory, and the area identified on our inventory that we possibly have some gaps in our programs is with the CSU and CRT. We've got a project right now in the works to develop both of those different facilities or programs, but those we don't have right now. And then which areas did this kind of identify as an area that we definitely want going forward is to improve our FACT team, because right now we do have an assertive treatment team, but they operate more along the lines of normal business hours. And then in the evening time, we've got our psychiatric emergency team that's able to attend. But having a more robust FACT team is something that will definitely be able to better support this program particularly. And then the supervision strategies that we identified were in-home visits, check-ins with the probation department, consultation with the room and board operators, and then just general monitoring to ensure that the client's engaging with everything they need to be engaging about. And then one open-ended area that we did have a question about was the on the inventory, the last section is for probation, and it says, service to address criminogenic risk. And so this brought up the question of, what does that look like, having probation services as part of this diversion program particularly?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. Are you asking that question now, or is that, oh, okay. I mean, I can answer a little bit, and then maybe I'll pass it to Ashley. There definitely are counties that are using probation for their diversion programs. I know to help with, some of that case management monitoring piece. I know there's some counties that use probation for their drug testing. And same thing, just like we've talked about, it's really important that they're really part of the team and that they're understanding and on board with what diversion is and, what this specific population needs, and that in many ways they don't, it's not the same as like a traditional probation client. But Ashley or Sean, do you want to add anything about that?
Yeah, sure. So there are a number of our current county programs that have a relationship with probation, and actually I believe Kern is one of them. So perhaps that's something that Sherry and Stephanie can touch on during their presentation. But yeah, a number of our programs had used probation previously, or probation was already involved in their mental health courts as a supervisory element. And so they usually have, depending on the size of the program, 1 to 2 probation officers who are assigned to perhaps the mental health court or to the diversion program. And they do help with the monitoring and the drug testing. Like Katie said, they have to follow slightly, different, I guess, rules of engagement, so to speak, than you normally would under probation, because these folks who they're supervising are pre-conviction, because this is a pre-trial program, so it changes kind of the dynamic a little bit. But there are a number of counties who I think have had a lot of success using their probation to help with this project. Hope that helps.
Nice. Yes, it does. Thank you.
Sarah, did you want to add something? I see a little hand is raised.
Yeah, I was trying to figure out how not to interrupt, but flag it. The only other thing I would say that I've seen in communities using and partnering with probation is that oftentimes probation officers have specialized training in some of those criminogenic interventions that I mentioned that are tailored for people with serious mental illnesses. So that might be a way that you build in some of those interventions to address criminogenic needs without adding or requiring like new training in local behavioral health staff.
Great, thank you. Sheila, do you want to introduce someone from Nevada County briefly?
Yeah, could I have someone with Nevada County just raise their hand, and we'll unmute you to do the report out. But while we wait for them to do that, just a brief overview. We were missing a couple of key folks because of technical issues, so we decided to wait on the inventory, something that they all are going to fill out, but we're going to wait on that. We mainly discussed Michael's case and whether, if he were in Nevada County, what service option, treatment and service options would be available to him in Nevada. Do we have a volunteer from Nevada to expand? I know there's a question or two that came up during our breakout that I would love for you all to pose to the group. Do we have a volunteer?
I see Phoebe Bell has her hand up, but I think she was one of the technical people having technical difficulties.
Yep.
I don't see anybody else with their hand raised.
I'll pose the question to the group then, and we'll see if I do it justice. But there was a little bit of a question around risk.
Like Carrie Klein. Sorry.
Oh, yes. I would love for Carrie to take it over.
All right, Carrie, you're unmuted.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay, sorry. We feel like there are services for this individual. We have a pretty good local organization, and I mean, honestly, like our behavioral health department totally rocks. I think that we definitely could provide services for this person. One of the questions that we had is like, what is the criminogenic risk we are looking at? Because if you look at the legislation refers you to 1170.18, which is super strikes. So what risk tool are we using to determine if someone's going to be a danger to commit a super strike?
That is a good question, Carrie. I don't know the answer to that. I don't know if Sean or Sarah have thoughts. I mean, each diversion program can choose which risk tool you want to use. So that's not part of like the statute, but Sean, do you want to try to take that? I'm sorry to just pass the buck.
So actually, I was wondering if Ashley or Sarah had an answer. I frankly am not sure how to respond to that.
Hi, this is Sarah. I am trying to unmute. Can everybody hear me?
Yeah.
Thanks. So yeah, you know, I won't weigh in on what is, you know, the tool you're supposed to use, but I have given both kind of sessions on different tools that might be options, and then also have done training with individual counties who might be specifically interested in certain tools, and in fact, Kern County was one of the counties I worked with. So it would really be about identifying the violence risk assessment tool or the risk assessment tool more generally that suits your specific kind of workflow, staffing, various issues. And I do believe we'll have another session on specific tools more generally. I will say that a lot of the violence risk tools are not going to be as specific as that. So it's going to be about considering a tool that gives enough ability to tailor to the individual circumstances and concerns, but acknowledging that there's going to be some behaviors that are more idiosyncratic and just sort of working that into the decision-making process. So, you know, I'm not going to today recommend one specific tool to you. I would want to know more about your county, who would fill it out, what information you have available, et cetera. But those are things we can certainly do, and I would suggest that you connect with Ashley and others on the program side who can then, you know, help coordinate that or connect us for more one-on-one sessions.
Thank you, Sarah. Yes, what Sarah just mentioned is correct. As far as I know, there is no risk assessment to determine someone's risk of committing a super strike offense in California. So if that's what you're looking for, like, that doesn't exist. But yeah, there's the violence risk assessment and, you know, recidivism assessment that you could use, but there's no risk assessment for super strike.
Yeah, no, thank you so much, Sarah. I really appreciate that. That's what I was kind of struggling with responding to. So just echoing what Katie and Sarah said, I concur.
Great. So I think now, I know we had a couple teams that didn't yet report back, but just for the sake of keeping things moving, we're going to move along to Kern County's presentation and discussion, and then I'll make sure to start with the other teams during our next breakout so that everyone has a chance to participate. But now I'm so happy to turn it over to Sherry and Stephanie, who are from Kern County, who are going to talk about what they're doing there, some of their challenges and successes, and then, you know, we really want to open it up to the group to ask them any questions.
I'm just switching slide deck.
Oh, okay, sorry, my computer crashed. So I will turn it over to Sherry and Stephanie. Oh, good.
I'm looking all around to see where the mute button is. Can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Yes, yes.
That was a yes. Now?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay. Thank you, Ashley, for inviting us. My name is Sherry Akins, and I'm a licensed marriage and family therapist, and I work for the County of Kern in the Behavioral Health Department. I supervise the SPO, or Supportive Pathway Opportunities Diversion team. And then my peer that's with me is Stephanie Costa, and I'll just let her introduce herself really quickly.
Hi, everybody. I'm Stephanie. Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Gotcha. Okay. Thank you. All right. I'm a recovery specialist with the Supportive Pathway Opportunities program out in Kern County, and I've been with Kern Behavioral Health and Recovery Services since 2016. So I'm happy to be here today. Hope you guys are gaining some much needed information, and hopefully we can be of help today. Thank you.
Ashley, will you be moving the slides, or?
Yes, I will be.
Okay,
so the next one?
Yes, please.
Okay.
So I'd just like to start off a little bit with Kern County. For those of you that aren't familiar with our county, it's a very large, geographically large county. So we cover a big square footage or mileage. We have a lot of outlying areas that have smaller communities. So sometimes we have challenges with getting those individuals into services. As you can see from the map, there's quite a few outlying areas. We're the 3rd largest county by area and the 20th largest county in the U.S. We've been referred to as the Golden Empire because of our gold, oil, and agricultural production. Next slide. Okay, I wanted to start off with a few statistics for the felony and competent to stand trial evaluations in our county. So for the fiscal year 2019 to 2020, there were approximately 203 felony and competent to stand trial evaluations requested. So you can imagine that's a large number. And so out of those 203 evaluations, 66 of those individuals were referred to the state hospital. 124 of them were referred to our admission, evaluation, and stabilization unit, which is located in our detention center. 9 of them were referred to Salinas Valley State Prison, and out of that 203, only 4 of them were referred to outpatient services. So with that in mind, you can see the need that we have in our county to have an outpatient program for these individuals. Next slide. So some of the goals and objectives for our team, we really want to focus on the individuals that are IST or incompetent to stand trial. We really want to reduce those state hospital placements by at least 20%. Our ultimate goal is to reduce it by 30%. We want to focus on improving the behavioral health and substance use services that these individuals are entitled to. And we really want to increase the housing. So we want to be able to provide housing, not only to provide that housing to them when they come into the program, but to help them sustain that housing when they graduate our program. We also want to reduce the recidivism. We've noticed that the referrals that we do receive, most of them are recidivists, so we really want to focus on that challenge. And then we really want to work to increase our community partner awareness. When we first started the program in January of 2020, when we reached out to the community, a lot of our partners in the community didn't even know what our program was about, and they didn't understand the whole concept behind it. Next slide. So as far as our specific diversion program, we titled it Supported Pathway Opportunities. Kern County participated in round 1 of the funding, so we were pretty proactive. We jumped on it. So we received our funding, and we started our program in January of 2020, and we got our first 2 clients in March of 2020. In March of 2020, I know I don't want to focus on COVID, but that's when the huge lockdown started with COVID. So we were faced with some real challenges. We had 2 clients. We had to figure out how to serve those clients with the lockdowns. So it was a little bit challenging, but we did it. Our program is a minimum of 1 year and a maximum of 2 years. The reason why we kind of started with the 1 year mark is we talked to our providers, our stakeholders, our court partners, and we just came up with, okay, let's start with a 1 year program. It'll go from 1 to 2, and that's based on how well the individual does in the program and whether they need to continue. Currently, we have served 41 individuals, and I just have to put a plug in for our new referral process. 3 of those individuals came straight off the Department of State Hospitals wait list, and I'll talk a little bit more about that later on in the presentation. We have the ability to serve 56 individuals. That's kind of an estimate, about 20 a year. And now we're going to be involved in the expansion, so we look to serve 11 more, so a total of 67. Next slide. Okay, some of the program highlights. We are a multidisciplinary team. We have a clinic, and we have a psychiatrist, an RN at the clinic. We have clinicians, therapists, recovery specialists, and most importantly, a substance use specialist on our team. The majority of the team has lived experience, and we utilize a FACT model. It sounds like many of you are familiar with the FACT model. It's a forensic ACT model. So it's very intensive outpatient wrap-style services. We don't ascribe to the traditional 8 to 5 hours. We can serve our clients after 5 o'clock. We can serve the clients on Saturdays and Sundays. We have an on-call line. The individuals can call in if they're suffering, if they're having issues with some of their symptoms being a little more exacerbated after 5, they can call us, and the staff members can call us. So we give support also to the staff of the housing facilities or maybe a family member. We do a lot of linkages to community partners, Social Security Office, Department of Human Services, those are just a few. So our referral process, most of our referrals come directly from the court system, and then we also started our second referral process, which is me looking directly at the Department of State Hospitals wait list, which we get from Correctional Behavioral Health. Most of those individuals, I think, have just kind of slipped through the cracks through the court system, and so we're looking at that very intently, trying to screen individuals on that list also. Some of the assessment tools that we use are the START risk assessment, the MMSE2, the TAPS, which is a substance abuse assessment, the CSSRS, the HCR, and as of this last year, the LSDMI, which is an excellent case management tool. We collaborate with our stakeholders weekly, so that means the judge, the public defender's office, the DA's office, and correctional behavioral health, and we also have a secure email chain to communicate with them if we need to. Next slide, please. So what are some of our program successes? I really, I hit on this almost every time that we have our meetings with DSH. I really feel like the communication with our stakeholders is really key. We were very proactive in having meetings before the program started, and we continue those meetings throughout. We meet with our stakeholders at least once a week, and it seems to be working out very well. Again, we use the FACT model. We have a lot of community linkages, and I want to say that most of our linkages, or a lot of them, are proactive. So our case manager, our clinician, when they're in the detention facility, they're screening the individual for what services they're going to need once they are released. So we're asking questions like, you know, have you ever received SSI or Social Security? Have you ever received benefits from the Department of Human Services? Do you need an ID? So we're very proactive in those linkages. So the case managers or the recovery specialists are already thinking about the community resources they need to link them to upon their release. I've got a great team. I just love their attitude. They have this sense of holding hope and the sense of people do recover. You know, I can't say enough good about the team and their attitude. You know, that holding hope and people do recover it goes a long way. One of the other successes is our discussion and education to community partners. So since COVID kind of lifted a little bit, it's given us an opportunity to get out in the community and really get our name out and help, you know, others understand what's going on, what our program's about, and how we can serve that vulnerable population. Another success is clinicians in the courtroom and clinicians at the detention center. So clinicians are in the courtroom, they have eyes on individuals that may slip by the judge or the PD, and we can talk about those individuals later on, so it's been pretty successful. Next slide, please. Some of the challenges. So, you know, everybody's had COVID challenges, and I don't want to focus on that, but, you know, there were a lot of challenges linking our individuals to community self-help groups. You know, the consistency, our clients didn't like the therapy over the phone. We really had to support them wholeheartedly in order for them to feel comfortable enough to talk to us over the phone. So since COVID's kind of lifted, that's better. Our therapy is in person. We have groups at our office. And during that time, some of our clients, they kind of expressed that they felt disconnected from the team, and we hated that feeling, but we worked on it. We helped support them, build rapport, and we got through that situation. I wanted to answer the probation question that we had before I turn it over to Ms. Costa. So probation plays a very, very key role on our team. We kind of look at them, our one probation officer, as more of the heavy hand, or he just kind of is a presence. He sees our clients once a week, so he's out in the community seeing them. He will do our drug testing. We don't typically do drug testing unless it's absolutely necessary, but we try to let him do that. That's kind of more his role. He is actually trained to work with behavioral health, so he has that training under his belt. And we use him as a safety measure. Sometimes if we have crises with our individuals and we have to go out into the community and maybe assess for a 5150, many times we'll take probation with us if we need to. And so as far as probation helping out with assessments, our probation team does a static risk assessment, which is an SRA assessment, and they do that during the process that the clinician is doing the evaluation. So the static risk assessment is, we ask for it right when the individual is referred to the STO program. They start working on that, and that assessment comes back to me, and that's just another tool to see, you know, where they're at, kind of low, moderate, or high, where are they at on the violent side, did they have any strikes. It gives us a better opportunity or more information about the individual so we can make the appropriate evaluation. Okay, next slide. Okay, Ms. Costa.
Okay, everybody. Hi, I'm back. All right. So yeah, a lot of exciting things have been happening in the program. You know, we're hitting our 2-year mark in January. So moving forward, what we would like to see happen and what has been happening is the streamlining of the evaluation process. When we first began taking in referrals, from the time we received it from the court to the time that we turned in the evaluation, it took about 3 weeks. And so we're trying to streamline that to get that time frame down to reduce the incarceration time of our individuals. So at this point, we're down to 2 weeks. So 2 weeks from the time we get the referral to the time we submit our evaluation and they go to court. That being said, when they go to court, we also have a 1 to 2 day turnaround time for when they are released from when they're granted into the SBO to being released from jail. So you have that 2 week time frame, and then they go to court, they're accepted in the program. So we try to release them the day after court, or at least a couple days after. So that 1 to 2 day time frame. Also, we have, moving forward, we would like to see more availability for our clinicians to be able to stay in the courthouse and on site at the correctional behavioral health, which is at the jail. Right now, we, due to everything going on with COVID and the availability of our clinicians, we are only there when necessary for the court, like when we have clients that are going to court or referral that is present in court, or going into the jails and stuff, which we only go in at this point to build rapport with our individuals and to complete the evaluation process. So moving forward, we would like to have at least one staff assigned to going into court every day and someone being stationed out at the jails. So they have that ongoing rapport and face-to-face contact. Also, streamlining our graduation criteria. So, I mean, we're very solution focused. We're ready for our clients when we feel like they're ready to graduate. We're excited. We're ready to go. So we just always want to make sure we're reaching out to the court, to the PD, the judge, the DA, making sure that everyone's on the same line and that their criteria matches our criteria. We want to make sure it's all good to go. And then moving forward, also more community involvement, meaning we want to be able to have more outreach opportunities. Not a lot has happened in the last couple of years, but we're hoping as things start to open up more and more events start taking place around the county, we would like to be able to outreach and let the community know more about diversion and the benefits that it offers, especially to family members, the support we can provide to individuals that will still remain living with their family or have family members that want to be heavily involved in their care. And then also an increase in forensic training opportunities, which kind of goes along with the last one, which we want to make sure our staff is trained and introduced in implementing the LSBMI to better serve individuals. We just have high hopes for the program, and we're just super excited to see how everyone else is going to be forming their program and getting it off the ground. So next slide, please. Okay. So that's it for our presentation. I'll hand it back to Sherry if there's any thoughts or questions or references.
So I'll turn it back to Ashley. Ashley, is my camera on? Can you see me?
It is not on. I can hear you though.
Shoot. I don't know how to change it. Okay, so we'll open it up to any questions from the audience.
Yeah, so for those out in the audience, if you want to, again, use the chat function to send in a question, you can also use the raise hand function. And I'm going to go through the list now. And it looks like I see Diane has her hand up, so I'm going to go ahead and unmute you, Diane.
Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Okay, I just had a quick question for Kern on the probation. Is probation assigned as, is it voluntary probation? Are they assigned as an MDT member? How are they assigned to the consumers? I'm just kind of a little curious about that process.
Excellent question. Can you see me now? I think my video's on.
Yeah, I can.
Wonderful. So our probation is actually assigned to our team. So we have one probation officer, and we also have a MOU with the probation department. So that one probation officer is actually assigned to our team. So he handles every case on our caseload.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
All right, so we have some questions that have come in the chat. First question, do you find more success with persons from the wait list versus referrals from the local courts?
Another good question. So we're very new at screening the individuals off the wait list. So we've only had 3 enter our program, but we've only been doing it for a couple of months. So I can't really answer that. I think, I don't think it really matters. I think we're going to have a success either way.
Okay, next question. Is your team dedicated to only serving this population, or do they also deliver services for outpatient clients and other programs?
Another good question. So a couple of the staff on my team have been with me for, gosh, 5 or 6 years. So they came over from the ACT team, I supervised ACT. So our SPO team, our SPO diversion team is very knowledgeable in that area, and they only serve our SPO clients.
We have a question. Well, first comment, say thank you that the presentation was super, and then wondering if you'd be willing to share your titles and email addresses with the group in case they have questions later.
Yes, absolutely. And we've also shared with other counties some of our templates for our reports. I know when Fresno County was getting their program up and going, did a lot of networking with that county and, you know, shared our reports and our thoughts back and forth. So absolutely, yes.
Great, thank you. Just scanning down to see if anybody else has their hand up. Carrie Klein, I see your hand's up, but I'm not sure if that's new or old. So I'm going to unmute you.
That's old.
Oh, okay.
I will say we are really looking forward to the expansion. You know, this program has been, you know, a really awesome learning opportunity. I have a lot of experience with ACT clients. The forensic piece was kind of new for me, and I just really enjoy this population and just really looking forward to continuing.
Awesome, thank you, Sherry. I'm not seeing any other questions. Sometimes it can take a little while if you're putting them in the chat. But I think maybe if you and Stephanie are going to be hanging out kind of to the end of the day, if there are any other questions, we can capture them then.
Yes, I'll be here.
Cool. All right. So I think we will turn it back over to Katie, and I will do a little switch of the presentation slides. Thank you so much, Karen. We really appreciate your presentation and being here today to help us with the project.
Our pleasure, thanks.
Yes, thank you, Sherry and Stephanie. That was really great. We had, oh great, yeah, Sherry put her email in the chat. We had planned for a quick break now, which I think we will still do because I know if we promise a break, we should have a break. So let's come back in 5 minutes. So at 3:57, let's come back and then we'll keep going. That would be great. Thank you.
Okay, we're back.
All right, so thank you everybody. We are back. I hope you had a nice break. So we wanted to just talk relatively briefly about the cultural considerations for treatment planning. You know, you could and should have like days-long training about this topic because it's so important and so key to this work. But we're just gonna, you know, kind of plant some seeds today about the importance of considering people's culture and backgrounds when assessing and completing treatment plans for diversion participants. I have the next slide, please. A lot of this information comes from SAMHSA's resource about improving cultural competence, which I really encourage everybody to look at. It's a very, very extensive resource and document. We can send around the link or the actual resource later because it's great, but just FYI, a lot of this comes directly from that. And a lot of this may seem obvious, but I think it's good to still point out that the role of culture should always be considered during initial intakes and interviews, screening and assessment, and in the development of treatment planning. You know, we've talked a lot about today already the importance of doing person-centered treatment planning, you know, helping clients buy into services, not creating client-resistant services like Deb mentioned, and really cultural considerations are so important to that piece. You know, as we say here, culturally responsive treatment can only occur when the making of clinical and programmatic decisions include culturally relevant information and practices and are endorsed and supported by staff, clinical supervisors, and the organization as a whole. Next slide, please. Again, the development of culturally responsive clinical services is vital to the effectiveness of behavioral health services. Culturally responsive skills can improve client engagement in services, increase and improve therapeutic relationships between client and provider, and improve treatment retention and outcomes, which again are the goals of any treatment, but especially diversion work. You know, this population, as we've talked about, have often had long histories of institutionalization, a lack of engagement in meaningful outpatient treatment. So really that therapeutic alliance and is so important, and when it's done with a cultural responsive lens, it's even more effective. Again, cultural competence is an essential ingredient in decreasing disparities in behavioral health. And important to note that the role of historical and racialized trauma in a person's life and community experience, as well as culturally affirming healing approaches, are vital in treatment planning. You know, Deb talked about very high rates of trauma for people with severe mental illness and people who are involved in the criminal justice system. So it's really key to be doing trauma-informed treatment planning as well as trauma-informed treatment. And, you know, there's a lot of resources and training around that in particular, and if people have questions or would like assistance with trauma-informed treatment, we can definitely maybe do some one-on-one TA, or you can reach out to Ashley to put you in touch with us. Next slide, please. This is just a direct quote about the importance of having culturally responsive staffing whenever possible in your treatment program. I'll just read this, that qualified, culturally diverse diversion case managers are among the most important components of effective diversion. Since ethnic and racial minorities are overrepresented in U.S. jails, constituting 57% of the country's jail population, diversion programs must be designed and implemented on the basis of the cultural experiences of people they are meant to serve. Moreover, since English is not the primary language for many detainees, bilingual case managers are often essential. So again, as you think about getting your program started, these are really important things to keep in mind, especially in a state like California where there's so many different languages spoken and so much diversity. Think about, and if you're not able to hire staff that speak languages other than English, using at least a phone translation line, or really needing to come up with a plan for that from the beginning, instead of when you're sitting there with a participant who you realize doesn't speak English and then trying to scramble. That's not a good way to develop a therapeutic alliance or develop rapport. Even if the person can't understand what you're saying, that could come across as obviously, disrespectful or unhelpful. So things to keep in mind. Next slide, please. And this is just a quick note, and I think we brought this up during our first day, but there are over 100 tribal nations in California, and there are multiple tribal nations in many of your counties. The 6 counties are participating now. And with Native people being incarcerated at disproportionate rates, inclusion of efforts with tribal nations is important when developing diversion program and diversion treatment plans. So again, something to keep in mind, here on our team, we have Dr. Rosemary Whiteshield, and this is her, one of her specialties is working with tribal nations. So if this is also something that your county is interested in learning more about or looking into, please reach out to us, and we could, again, do some one-on-one TA or provide resources or information about specific Native communities or tribal nations that your county works with, to really make sure that your treatment services are appropriate for who you are working with. So I think, can I see the next slide, please? That is, oh yes, good. So here are, again, these are pretty straightforward, but I think they're just helpful things to think about when you want to create a culturally responsive treatment plan in this order. Of course, you're going to engage the client, familiarize the client and family members with the evaluation and treatment process, endorse collaborative approaches to facilitating interviews, conducting assessment, and planning treatment, obtain and integrate culturally relevant information and themes in your treatment plan, gather culturally relevant collateral information, select culturally appropriate screening and assessment tools, determine a person's readiness and motivation for change, and then, of course, providing the culturally responsive case management. And it's also important to remember that we really shouldn't put it on our participants to teach us about their culture. Of course, we want their engagement in this process, but it should really be on us as clinicians and staff to familiarize and educate ourselves as much as possible about people's background and culture, so that that burden isn't on the participants, especially, again, as you develop rapport with people who especially have long histories of disengagement from treatment, a mistrust of treatment, long histories of institutionalization. That's just really key to not develop that kind of dynamic as much as possible. So also, familiarize yourself with what is going on in your county, trying to hire staff as much as possible who are aligned with your mission, and the participants in your program is just so key. Next slide, please. Okay, great. So that, again, was a really quick overview.
Katie, we have a question in the chat.
Oh, great.
So one of the attendees wants to know approximately how many hours of specialized training would these teams need in addition to traditional training or skill building?
Training around like the cultural considerations of treatment. Is that what the question is asking?
I think so. I mean, it's from your presentation.
Yeah, okay, sure. That's a good question. I mean, I said that at the beginning without a exact number in my mind, like a number of hours or a number of treatment, I mean, a number of training. I would just, I guess, encourage like as much as possible. You know, it probably depends on your individual agencies, how much like time can be set aside to training. I mean, yeah, I mean, I would argue you should spend at least a full week just on these types of issues, but I think it can be flexible. I don't know if anyone else on the panel or anyone else in the audience has thoughts about that question, though. It's an interesting one.
This is Hallie from the Justice Center, and I certainly would encourage anyone on our team as well. I know that in the field over the last number of years, there's been a movement away from the term cultural competency as like an on-off switch and towards better cultural understanding, cultural humility, with the idea that it's a process and it's like any of our professional skills, something that we continue to educate ourselves about. So it looks like the Kern County team is providing some examples of what they're doing in the chat, but I guess I would encourage you to, if you haven't made that switch yet, to think about like, you know, cultural competency not being a, yes, I've got it, no, I don't, and more of a progression of skills like many of your other professional skills.
Thank you, Hallie. Are there other thoughts or questions from the audience or from the panelists about anything that I just touched on?
Katie, this is Sherry from Kern. I was just going to kind of reiterate also, I'm a clinical supervisor, and, you know, the cultural piece, the competency piece is just ongoing. I mean, it's something that we discuss and weekly in our supervision sessions. It's just, I agree, it's not you need 12 units of cultural competence. It's just an ongoing process.
Thank you. Yes, these are really, really good, important points for sure.
Hey, this is Rosemary Whiteshield. Just wanted to add something. Certainly agree with everybody's comments. I think that my input would be to consider exploring what cultural affiliations and training that staff have had already, especially if there are staff that have lived experience in the communities already in terms of the clients that are being served. And also it is, in my professional opinion, an ongoing process like that had been mentioned. And also I think it's more about developing cultural capacity in terms of being responsive. And the other insight that I would like to add is that sometimes in the past I've seen cultural competency training or programs be sort of a one-size-fits-all, that if people are understanding themselves to be competent in one area, then in some cases they might consider that those skills or that knowledge base is transferable. And I would encourage people to consider that may not be the case, and so to, you know, seek out at the level of knowledge, skill, and knowledge base and skill level, as well as lived experience in the community, what are key areas for further growth in terms of the populations that they're serving. Just wanted to add that. Thank you.
Thank you, Rosemary. Thank you so much. All right, any other thoughts or questions or comments? Okay, and these, of course, are things that will come up in our other Academy sessions and other DSH training opportunities. And yeah, again, just kind of planting seeds here about things you really should be thinking about as you start to plan your program. So now we're going to break out into county breakout groups again, and we're going to talk through some more of the questions from your program plan around treatment services, supervision of people, really get more detailed about those types of things. So we'll spend, I think, about like 30 minutes, 25 to 30 minutes in our breakout, and then we'll come back together to report in and do some wrap up.
All right, Katie, whenever you're ready.
Okay, thank you. Great. I hope that breakout group was productive. We'll, again, kind of go around if you want to, again, obviously you don't have to answer every question, but just summarize what you discussed. And I'll start, I guess, with Joey, who wants to introduce someone or a person from San Joaquin County. That would be great.
Hi, Katie. Thank you for passing it over to me. So for San Joaquin, we have Ellen here. It was just me and Ellen today. And she is actually under Judy Ann's account right now. It's a little mixed up with the links. But yeah, no, we had a really great discussion. And if if Ellen, if you wanted to share a little bit of what we discussed.
Sure, I'd be happy to. The discussion centered around the identification of clients for participation in the program, what steps we would take to determine appropriateness for participation, which would include an evaluation by a psychologist to determine whether or not the individual is appropriate to participate from a risk assessment standpoint, their responsivity to the participation aspects of the program, and most importantly, the concept of med compliance in the jail. If they're not going to be med compliant in the jail, then at least under our protocol, we would not be considering those clients for participation. Our program will be, or at least we're anticipating, hiring a social worker. And that social worker will be meeting with the client at the jail and connect with the client immediately so that the client can be followed throughout their participation in the program by the social worker, who will continue to be part of the individual's life, address their needs, whether those needs are related to funding or substance abuse or whatever their particular needs are, so that they can feel that they have an individual advocate who will follow them through the program, which I think will be very, very helpful. We're considering what other outside programs can be leveraged, substance abuse programs, existing mental health programs in our community. We have a program called the Gibson Center that we are going to utilize that offers day programming, and with the expectation that the clients will be participating in day programming, also gaining work or employment skills. That program does provide some training, as well as an opportunity for the clients to earn a small stipend for working in that program. The social worker would also be identifying what their strengths and weaknesses are, so we can assist the clients in working on their strengths, whether it's getting a GED or getting a driver's license, whatever those issues are for the clients, we hope to empower them. Ultimately, we're hoping to partner with one of several private agencies that hopefully can provide housing and wraparound services in the housing environment. Hopefully, we can have one board and care that will accommodate all of our clients that we're serving during the course of the grant, such that we can feel assured and the community can feel assured that they have eyes on them 24/7 and that they can work towards their success and ultimately their independence.
That all sounds great. Okay, great. Now, I don't know, Tracy or someone from Tuolumne is able to raise their hand or jump in.
Can you all hear me?
Yes.
Oh, yes. Wonderful. Okay, great. Yes. Yeah, we had a wonderful discussion, and I don't know if Brock Colby, if you don't mind, Brock raised some really wonderful questions and you know, thought points to some of our discussion. So if you don't mind, Brock, do you want to give a synopsis of what we discussed?
Oh, there we go. Am I muted? Can you hear me now?
We can hear you. Thanks, Brock.
Okay, great. Basically, in Tuolumne County, from behavioral health point of view, we can basically mimic the intensive case management model, as you often see through full service partnerships that was mentioned earlier in the training today. We can, we're looking at how we could provide after hours wraparound, which we have to build first. So we're basically looking at a model where we provide intensive case management, peer specialist support, as well as other traditional mental health services to address the participants' needs. We also talked a little bit near the end of our session about possibilities of working with the court on how we can, whether it's possible to have a piggyback these cases with drug court or some kind of mental health court. That's still, you know, kind of in the early discussion stage. From behavioral health treatment, going back to that, we're also looking at how we can integrate dual diagnosis treatment for the participants, including recovery counselors in the treatment team that will be providing services. So basically, we're looking at an intensive rehab and case management model to address these participants' needs.
Great, that all sounds really good. Yeah, it sounds like you're thinking about a lot of really important pieces of this. Great. Now maybe, Hallie had said that Julie Morgan from Madeira can present. Can we unmute Julie Morgan, please?
This is Julie. We discussed possible workflow for identifying clients. We also discussed some of the concerns we might have locally for housing some of the identified clients due to some of the limits. And so we're looking forward to Thursday's meeting to hear how other counties are addressing some of those issues.
Okay, great. I'm going to remind everybody before we end it, our next session is on Wednesday, November 3rd. But it will be amazing, all about housing. Yeah, because we all know that's just such a huge piece of this. Great. Anyone from Nevada County? I'm sorry, I can't remember. Carrie, are you from Nevada County? Or Sheila, do you want to introduce somebody?
Yes, thank you, Katie. This time we're going to have Jeff Goldman, who's going to tell us a little bit about our discussion today. Jeff?
Okay, so ours wasn't as in-depth as to the specifics of what we're doing because we're still kind of in this limbo zone of checking or determining kind of the feasibility of the program. We discussed kind of the programming that we currently have and the capacities that we have in those programs, and one of the barriers being supportive housing. That we have housing, but we don't have any beds available in those houses, in in the current housing. So, you know, we would have to, someone else would have to not get housing for someone in the program to get housing. And what's kind of the tipping point of how many participants would need to be in the program to where we could financially afford to expand the housing locally. You know, we did talk about the criminogenic needs and those sorts of things, and the support of the probation department, and like I said, the programs that we currently have. And we also talked about kind of the crossover of just the folks that have already been determined to go to the state hospital, or the folks that are currently in diversion caseloads that we have now, and the possibility of moving those over to potentially the new program.
Okay, sounds good. Great. Tulare County, right? We haven't heard from Tulare yet. Deirdre, do you want to introduce somebody, or does somebody want to raise? Yes.
If it's okay, we're going to break the format again as a group and ask some questions.
Good.
So things that came up during our breakout that the group would like some feedback on, can some of the money from this program be used for incentives or to overcome barriers to treatment, things like bus tickets, things like that?
I'll let Ashley answer that, but my understanding is yes, it can be used for anything, including incentives. Is that correct, Ashley?
Yep, that's correct.
I think the only thing is you can't give cash directly to clients. People have asked that before, but otherwise I think you can buy anything you need, which is a really helpful engagement tool, I'll add.
And we had one other question that came up. We had talked a little bit in the breakout and earlier about the intervention curriculums, and can some examples of those either be talked about now or sent out to the groups so that they can review and make informed decisions?
Yes, I can help with that, maybe with Ashley or with Sean, in terms of sending around information. I personally have been trained in the reasoning and rehabilitation 2 curriculum, and you do have to be trained to do that. It's not in the public domain. I love that curriculum. I could be kind of like a spokesperson for R&R. It's a lot of work, but it's really impressive. So I'm happy to maybe talk like separately about reasoning and rehabilitation, but yes, I'll definitely gather some information about those types of criminogenic risk interventions.
Thanks. I think that was all we wanted to discuss. Unless someone else in the group wants to raise their hand, but yeah.
Okay, perfect. That was every team, correct? My team, Stanislaus, isn't here today, but that's okay. Great, so is there one more slide, Ashley? Yeah, great. Just a reminder, again, our next session is Wednesday, November 3rd, so 2 days from today. It's really impressive. I'll just say I've been helping with some of the planning and development. It really is going to be really impressive, and I hope I've already learned a lot just in like these planning meetings, so it's going to be really tailored to this audience in particular. So I really hope you all and anyone else who's going to be working on this program can and should join. I'd really encourage as many people as possible to be there. And then our 5th and final session is a week from today, November 8th. But with that, are there any final questions, comments? Ashley, Sean, did you want to add anything before we wrap up?
I'm just going to say really quickly that when I send the slides out tonight as kind of a follow-up after this meeting, I will also resend the registration links for the next 2 days, and next Wednesday, this coming Wednesday session is again focused on housing specifically, and then our final session will be more risk management in the community, as well as we're putting together another panel discussion with more of our current DSH counties. So more information coming out, and I will resend those registration links.
The only thing I was going to add is, you know, with that last question about resources and so forth, feel free to reach out. This is Sean Evans, by the way, to either Ashley or myself with specific questions. We're always willing to provide any sort of technical assistance and sort of share any information. So, you know, yeah, I just want to put that out there as a resource, and I'm happy to dialogue with folks if there's like something more specific that's, you know, easier discussed, you know, on a conference call or something like that. So I just wanted to put that out there.
Thank you, Sean. All right, so I think that's it. Thank you again, everyone, for your time and attention today. I know it's a lot of information in a relatively short amount of time. So have a great rest of your afternoon and evening, and we will see you all on Wednesday.
Thank you, everybody. Have a great night.
Thank you, everyone. Take care. Goodbye.